Kerr to be followed by Bob Doris, around 6 minutes. Mr Kerr.
Presiding Officer, let me take a different tact, because I believe that for far too long the people of Scotland have been sold the lie that more government and higher taxes are the answer to every problem. And yet, after years of expanding government, taxes and bureaucracy, we have a country where people work harder but take home less, where pensioners can't afford to heat their homes. I thought it was very brave of Faisal Chowdhury to talk about families suffering a form of fuel poverty, when his Labour government has forced pensioners, many of them, into that situation. But we live in a situation where businesses are labouring under the crushing weight of regulation and taxation, where the SNP and Labour cling to their leftist fantasy that government is the solution, when in reality government is a big part of the problem. The SNP here and Labour in Westminster have raised income tax, frozen thresholds and imposed punishing council tax hikes while failing to provide basic services. They've made life more expensive and difficult. This is not government standing up for working people. This is government bleeding them dry. The average Scot now hands over nearly half of what they earn to the government in some form of taxation, between income tax, national insurance, VAT, fuel duties, council tax and endless stealth taxes. And it's no wonder that working people are finding it harder just to stand still. The government takes, and what do Scots get in return? Crumbling roads, longer NHS waiting times, overstretched schools and local councils that can't even keep all the streetlights on. Where is all the money going? Public sector employment has grown far beyond that which is sustainable. Not because we're getting better services, but because the SNP has spent taxpayer money on bloated bureaucracy. Scotland now spends more on government administration per head than almost anywhere else in Europe. Labour campaigned on the promise not to raise taxes. Yet in October's budget, they increased taxation by £40 billion. And they announced plans to borrow a further £142 billion. The SNP incoherently bemoans the cost of living while burdening people with the highest taxes of any part of the United Kingdom. When it comes to Labour and the SNP, it turns out that Rishi Sunak was right, especially about Labour's tax plans, though it turns out that even he underestimated the scale of their tax rises. Labour, I will give way.
Paul O'Kane.
He mentions Rishi Sunak, and I made this point to him earlier. The man who gave working people the highest tax burden in a generation would be the first point to put on record. And secondly, is he going to take any cognizance of 14 years of a Conservative government, as Liz Smith rightly did, that Liz Truss and the decisions she made in her catastrophic mini-budget is what we're living with the reality of now?
Stephen Kerr, I'll give you the time back.
I think Paul O'Kane needs to think carefully about blaming the Conservatives for the highest tax burden in 80 years, which I acknowledge was true at the time. But the Labour government, of which he is so proud, have increased them even further. So I think he has to be proportionate in this. And I acknowledge that Labour, and I think he should too, because I know that Paul O'Kane is a man of integrity, they have broken the promises they made on taxes. And especially when it comes to the decision to remove the winter fuel allowance, one of the most disgraceful decisions by a UK government post an election, when they promised to do the opposite, that I think any of us can ever remember. Meanwhile, as Graham Simpson mentioned, Labour's GB Energy has been exposed, frankly, as a sham. Chief Executive admitted, again, very honestly, it's going to take 20 years just to create 1,000 jobs. I mean, the SNP and Labour are blindly pushing net zero policies that burden households with costs while offering no realistic alternatives. Compliance costs with green regulations are atmospherically high. And I'm grateful to Fergus Ewing for drawing attention to this Parliament on previous occasions the case of the Elgin Procurator Fiscal's Office, which is valued at £275,000 as a property, and yet is set to have £3.5 million spent on it in a refurbishment. This is just another expression of the kind of reckless spending of chasing net zero by 2045 that ignores financial reality. And I echo all the calls that have been made by speakers for reality. So let's talk about the reality of the North Sea oil and gas industry, which supports over 100,000 jobs and plays a significant role, a critical role, in our energy security. And by the way, it's jobs that we should be really focusing on in this Parliament. The creation of jobs, the protection of jobs, the idea that it's good to work. I think Willie Rennie covered that really well in his speech. And yet the SNP and Labour, I will give way to the Minister.
Very briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Would Stephen Kerr recognise that the potential for creation of jobs in Scotland when the oil and gas basin declines as it is doing is with renewable energy, which will also take us to net zero?
Stephen Kerr, if you could begin winding up, please.
But this is the Energy Minister that just received a letter from the Just Transition Commission warning the Minister that there will be no jobs for the 400 workers at the Grangemouth refinery in foreseeable years to come. That's the nature of the transition. And if it's going to be just, then these issues need to be addressed. And it's not helped when Labour burden the oil and gas sector with further increases to the already high energy oil and gas profits levy, killing investment stone dead and risking thousands of jobs. I understand that I must now wind up, and so let me just simply say this, Presiding Officer. There are many issues which we have covered in this debate, but we have to get to the root causes of why our country is where it's at. And it is time for leadership. And the Scottish Conservatives will not apologise for advancing the argument for lower taxes and cheaper energy, because I didn't get to talk about nuclear, and I wish I had, and a government that treats working people as more than easy targets for tax. Scotland can't afford more of this socialist same. It is time to stand up for the people of Scotland. Our party will do so, and will end this relentless attack on the finances of households and businesses.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call